So economic update. This has been, I have to say, like, as someone who does this stuff professionally, has been doing it for a long time, talks with a lot of other professors. This is a really, really essentially crazy time, right? And it comes in many different versions of this, right, Mike? Here, for example, is the U.S. Department of Labor, right? This is like a normal, staid, boring federal building, right? If you've ever been to D.C., like, it's not like these things get all gussied up that often. And we now have a bunch of this going on. So how does this relate to econ? I think is one of the central things. There's many ways we can think about this as moral problems, scary political problems, which are all very central, but there's economic aspects of this as well. So one thing I'd say, right, normally like this style of like, oh, I should go like talk with humans in a normal way about my research stuff has like a climate-y background, right? Normally my research is in climate and like it's motivated by the fact that I think it's existentially dangerous and we're going in a really bad direction, right? Generically, what I'd say, what I kind of give people the rundown on this is that it's a pretty bad news time for the global climate, but we're in the middle of the sharp pull through, right? That is to say, it's been getting hotter on the planet faster than we thought it would. And along these lines, a bunch of the impacts that we're seeing are now occurring earlier than we thought that they would occur, and they're looking potentially worse. And so I'd say updating this stuff, if you're just kind of like checking in on climate change things, it's easy to kind of lose sight of this in the background with the news. But this is, I'd say, the overall trajectory of what's going on with the globe. The good thing is that generally technology and geopolitics have now begun to really, really, really respond to the climate problem. So much so that, I would say the next decade or so is make or break. But hopefully, fingers crossed, unless the rest of the talk points us in the direction of things really, really collapsing, right? In a lot of ways, it's even kind of out of the US's hands, right? But so what do I mean by this in terms of the timing stuff, right? At the end of the day, the climate is a physical system, and humans are these like fast-acting little weird, speedy cultural things, right? And so I always like to point out, we were coming out of a nice little interglacial period with warm weather, might like hang around, invent some agriculture, maybe like domesticate an animal or two, have little empires, things are cool. And then slowly cooling down. And then in the past 200 years or so, right, we got into the fossil fuels and started emitting them. And we're doing it at about 100. We're basically changing the climate on the order of 100 times as fast as it should be changed. Right. And so in a lot of ways, the intuition on this is that it's just like this whiplash effect on all these systems, right? All of a sudden, winter's not coming when you're expecting, et cetera, et cetera. Right. And so this has generally been accelerating, right? The trend from like 80 through 2000 is now markedly lower than the trend from the past 10 years, which is bad. It basically points to a variety of things that we're not too sure about. Part of this, to be frank, there's all kinds of complications in here. Cleaning up a bunch of the pollutants actually has like made the atmosphere less shiny, which is to say that it lets more of the radiation through. Which is to say that we have one of these like classic sorts of like sulfur dioxide offset effects that cleaning up a whole bunch of the atmosphere has actually potentially made things warm up even faster, right? Add in methane releases, add in the fact that possibly, and this might be the scariest thing, the climate simply may just be more sensitive than we think. So this is the trajectory that we're on. Normally, when I think about giving updates, I'm like, let's keep our eye on the prize writ large. Back in 2023 in the Biden administration, you could kind of just let the economy do its thing for a bit and focus on more serious, pressing existential stuff. And so in this domain of things, I think it's important to take home that the impacts are bad and getting worse, right? We've already seen things like the LA wildfires were absolutely catastrophic, right? This is the normal domain of work that I do, and things like the El Niños are bad and getting worse in terms of their potential effects, right? And after like we were doing really, really great with things like general malnutrition, starvation risk, up until about like sometime in the 20 teens, and now we're kind of U-turning back out. And so in context after context after context, we're just getting worse and worse types of weather, right? And it is going to continue to get worse until we stop the emissions and bring it back in line, right? Generically, one thing that I would say to keep in mind, so actually one of the World Food Program related projects that we're possibly going to be working on is looking at the interaction between climate oscillations and a bunch of these federal government cuts, because a whole bunch of what Elon Musk did when he ripped out the back end of USAID was do these large scale cuts in like humanitarian aid and medicine and similar. And so one of the research projects we have is basically interacting the El Nino footprint forecast for 2026 with a whole bunch of the cuts to be like, where are we going to see possibly some of the worst types of damages popping out? With this kept in mind, there's some other things that I think are important to kind of keep your eye on. One of them is that like, this is not just like a impacts getting worse with higher temperatures. We're also getting novel phenomena. In particular, we're now pretty sure that if we do not stop emissions, we're going to collapse the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, which is what keeps a nice way of thinking about this is you may have noticed on the planet, like on a globe before, that like London and England is on the same latitude as like Eastern North Canada. And like, how is it not frozen with ice? And well, there's this general circulation in the ocean that brings a whole bunch of warmth up from the tropics, dumps it out over here. And it's a big part of why Europe is not ice, like Canada. And so it looks like that thing's just going to turn off this century if we don't get our act together. So that means we have to very, very rapidly decarbonize. And in 2025, I'd say we're about 10 years post-Paris Agreement. And Paris was very, very, widely derided as like too little, too late, quite weak. But it's a relational contract that seems to be progressively ratcheting things closer and closer to place. We're coordinating, right? So like solar is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly cheap now, right? It's so cheap that it's now spreading like wildfire, right? We now have majority clean energy vehicles in places like China, right? The UK has completely stopped using coal. One of the weird side effects of Trumpist stuff is that a whole bunch of trade stuff is just unraveling real quick. And some countries are just like, oh, okay, well, as long as it's kind of chaos anyway, like why not redo our energy system? So like 20 countries in Africa just imported record amounts of solar. I don't know if you've been following like what's going on in Pakistan, for example, just like night and day shift in the electrical grid. So with this stuff, I like to kind of normally give a talk that's like, let's like talk about this stuff for an hour and go into all some detail, like general background climate stuff for a generalist audience. And then I end with stuff like this, right? And I'm like, okay, it's like, what are some things you can do? I do generally think, you guys are students, and as I will say repeatedly, like education is a weapon that is meant to be wielded against others. To like take these things seriously, like have your own specific type of pet project or whatever, right? My old advisor, Doug Almond, was like a fetal origins health economist. And after a certain point, he just got so pissed about this stuff that he's now like a methane guy. And he's all this stuff specifically being like, okay, what can we do to just do methane monitoring from space? Because that's the worst greenhouse gas. And we should be able to see this stuff from space, just clamp down on these things, right? Similarly, like I think just talk with your politicians, like giving people a hard time, being like, no decarbonizing. To an extent to which I think it's that general approach over time really makes sense, right? Like get to net zero, force other organizations to do so, be vocal and active about it, right? In this domain, right, kind of echoing up where I'm about to give you a bunch of advice for how to respond to the political stuff, I think it's really important to think about what material changes you actually accomplish with the efforts that you put into changing systems, right? And so I think, for example, a classic thing that we'll see with undergrads, right, is you'll be like, oh, I really want to do something, and then you want to put a bunch of energy into it, and then it's like, okay, like, we've got awareness on something, as opposed to being like, oh, like, come forward with a demand. Don't just come with awareness. Like, go be like, okay, we want this and this and this, and like, let's actually think about specific material changes. Like, oh yeah, like maybe divest from fossil fuels, organization X. So, generically, what I would say is, if you're over in the climate side, it's like, like come talk to me. B, it's an incredible time. It is, compared to like 10 years ago, a much more hopeful time. Like, I think that's one of the things I have to get across is that 10 years ago, it was like climate change was bad and getting worse. And it did not look like the technology was there for us to really push things through. At this point, it's now an organizational problem, which is great. The thing is, when I normally do this talk, I'm like, here's some themes to think about, right? Going into the 2020, like what is climate change going to bring, right? Well, we're going to have more extremes, right? One of the things, and actually I'll dwell on this for just 1 second. One of the things about a lot of climate change operating through the El Niños and similar is that it correlates the global experience of climate change. So everybody has bad events all at once when you've had like a bad El Nino summer, like 2 summers ago, right? It's like massive flooding here and massive storms here, and everyone always like, whoa, like what is going on with the climate? And it becomes these weird synchronized shocks. We already know, for example, that these things seem to do a lot of damage to the macroeconomy and growth trajectories. Right? The new energy system that's emerging is wild and really, really changes a bunch of geopolitics, which is, I think, another nice thing to keep in mind. It is part of the subtext of the whole Trump era, in the sense that, oh yeah, like if it's no longer wars about oil, which was a lot of what was dominating US foreign policy for decades there, then what exactly is the nature of conflict and how does it work? Right. And then I'd say there's kind of, there's major possible cultural changes in the work, both good and bad, and rapid swings in the evolution of the response, right? I think it is by nature a crazy time right now, partly because planetarily we've kind of like started pushing against some serious environmental things, and now we're doing like a full transformation of the energy system, which is already kind of a drama period. And if you go over and you talk with people in other parts of the social sciences about like what to expect from a lot of this, right? There is like a couple of things that pop out in common, right? In the sense that what seems to be happening as we face a bunch of these environmental types of threats is general consensus is to not quite understand the nature of the collective action problem. And you get politicians who pop up and are like, oh, okay, like how about instead we outgroup and scapegoat and similar. And so one of the things that's particularly odd about thinking about the economy at present is that Trump is like one instance of a phenomenon that we see, like 2024 is a crazy anti-incumbent year, right? Like people went through the pandemic and like all these countries all around the world has like booted people out of power over and over and over. Like Mexico was one of the only places that didn't, right? And so we had this happen, but in an odd way for us. And so, I think one of the ways of thinking about how nuts this is this was printed summer of 2016 by the Boston Globe. At the time, it was considered absolutely outrageous. Like, imagine what it would be like if this guy followed through and all the stuff that he said, right? And they were like, they printed it in, whatever it was, like July of 2016. And they're like, think about what it'd be like 3 months in when this guy is president if he's doing all of this stuff. Did he do all of this stuff last time? No. Why? We're not quite sure. It is complex in a bunch of ways. One thing that does seem to be the case is that there were a large number of people who were adults in the room in the last administration, right? And we have stories about like, not Bessent, who was it? One of his, there were a couple of people, for example, Treasury and whatnot, who are clearly aware of the fact that economics has rules and you can't just break them. And we have a bunch of stories from the last instance of his White House of people like actually taking papers off of his desk so that he couldn't sign them. And they would keep him away from him from long enough that he would forget. And then they're like, oh, wow, we really, like apparently he almost tried to put tariffs on South Korea at like 50%. And that was one of these instances where like, goink, just distract him for a couple of days. So we are now in this is no longer a fantasy version of this, which is awful. And so here are stylized economic facts. Trump, and I'd say a key part of understanding this is Trump is openly like a former mobster type guy, like not to be the New Yorker, but he's very culturally of that domain. He clearly like the gaudy stuff, everything. And he's from real estate, and intra-real estate was very widely acknowledged as a specific type of persistent scam. And so I think in a lot of ways, part of what's really messing with us is that we're observing this and trying to think like, okay, the US president is doing some stuff. Like we're thinking about it like it's a presidency, when really the presidency has been occupied by a criminal network, more or less. Last presidency of his was not like this. It was still kind of like the Republican Party was trying to figure out why they'd elected this Trump guy and we're going to try and make it work. We're now in odd, uncharted territory. And in particular, there's key institutions that they are threatening or have already damaged, and in some cases more or less destroyed, that play pivotal roles, right? Things like the Federal Reserve that are central to just like stability, right? That means that we're more or less now like entering the bad times. And I'm going to show you a bunch of stuff now in the next like 20 minutes or so that's like bad sign after bad sign after bad sign. The critical weird aspect of this is that it feeds back into the information networks, right? A big part of the problem is that like, when I say Trump and his criminal associates, like I'm being pretty direct about the obvious fact that there's like shall we say, what's the classic word we use for this in racketeering? A network. But there's also this very literal news network like Fox News, and simply there's like 23 plus people who are actually employed in the executive branch right now who are formerly from Fox News itself, right? And so there's a variety of things in this where we kind of have 20th century norms about like, okay, like you're not supposed to go after media organizations. So we really don't know what to do when the media organizations are actively colluding with a weird power grab, right? Ooh, what did I do here? Oh, my apologies. But these are basically, I was in the middle of updating this and I was like, oh, I'm showing them too many red warning things. So here's what I would say. We're now entering a period of major instability, and it's going to resolve in odd ways in the next couple of months. A standing thing I've kind of been thinking in this domain is, Trump has well-established criminal ties that go back quite a bit. And in a bunch of ways, this is kind of now like the revenge of America's enemies from the 20th century going, it's just like, oh, you're like the South Africans, right? Remember, like we teamed up with a bunch of the rest of the world and finally put sanctions on them and like broke apartheid. And now like a bunch of the like Teal over here, right? Like Teal is like huge in DOD, right? Musk himself, right? Similarly, right? Trump has old ties to Russia. It's actually it's one of these things. I hate conspiracy stuff. I'm an economist. I'm normally really anti-conspiracy anything. I think like you read about these guys' meetings and all this stuff, and it's like, okay, like you're hitting me over the head with this. Like obviously there's a bunch of bizarre relationships going on here. And the thing is, right, like Putin's an active war criminal. He's killing lots of people, right? And so the extent to which we now have this clear, like, oh, like our president is chatting with random bad actors who are kind of like the sum of America's least wanted from the past couple of decades, right? And so what this means, right, is that we now have this very difficult to navigate sort of like web of stuff where there's some people that seem to be popping up who are like literally espousing Nazi class ideology. And we're not quite sure, like, how are we supposed to take the idea that like JD Vance chats with these guys? What are we supposed to do when we listen to Stephen Miller like yell into the camera and it really is like crazy white nationalist talking points? And this guy is representing the US government. So this is part of why I think trying to make too much sense of it as an ideological push doesn't make too much sense, because it's kind of incoherent. It is this grab bag of different bad actors, all exerting control on one central guy who is basically just an unreformed real estate scammer, right? So I'm going to send the slides after this. This is way back, again, from the summer of 2016, before he was even a nominee. One of the most insightful things I ever read was this random conservative guy who works in real estate who was like, the thing is, you guys don't get this. This guy is like a standard trope. He is like 100% a specific type of social scam that operates in high-end real estate. And basically, it's an arbitrage between your ability to raise funds from others through investment and the lag in their ability to punish you legally. And so you can kind of get away with this eternal scam ratchet case thing, right? It failed on him in the mid 80s when we had the 87 stock market crash. And that's when he first went to Russia and apparently ended up with a bunch of additional cash. So I would say to a certain extent, an easy way of thinking about this is we just have a very corrupt, self-centered, more or less criminal case who has managed to occupy the presidency. And this is now causing a lot of problems. A central problem in this, the running theme of all of this, is that this is an assault on the rule of law itself. The institutions require a degree of trust and fidelity to function over time. And if CEOs start feeling like they have to open-handed, like I'm going to bribe the guy with a little gold brick in exchange for investment, right? This sort of thing is becoming like this was the sort of thing that if you can you imagine if Obama had been given a golden brick by a visiting CEO in exchange for like policy stuff? It was a massive scandal, right? But in keeping with the idea that this is a weird patronage network, we now have a ton of these interpersonal relationships, right? It's an odd thing to observe. This is from the inauguration, right? And a key thing that I pointed out then, which was when I gave the ASUSF talk, right? This is actually the opening slide. Because when you think about this, right, these are the billionaires, and what are they each sitting on top of? Someone from MSAE, perhaps? What types of firms are these? These are some two-sided platforms. These are big information networks in one form or another. There's the big information network for managing like collegiate identity, social media stuff. There's the big information network for coordinating sale of goods, right? There's the big information network for email and similar. And then there's one of the big information media networks. Twitter was like the big public weird news site. It was where you could go and get verified journalists and be like, what's actually happening? Oh, well, they're doing a job of keeping eyes on the ground. So this guy bought it. And basically Fox News did. It is, I think, odd to us sometimes to just like step back and try and observe how a bunch of the media polarization works. And I think it's also really central to messing with our ability to understand what's going on, because we'll try to do these simple things like, how could people vote for this? Do people understand? And the issue is that if you're like a median draw American in a rural place, the news media environment that you get is heavily driven by this. And so your understanding of what's going on is just different. And this has now been heavily exploited and is the kind of thing that like the guys in the inauguration photo actively try to keep us from preventing them from doing, right? I will say that being an economist at the University of San Francisco is funny because you end up chatting with tons and tons of people. I have chatted with a bunch of people who are quite senior at Facebook who are like, oh yeah, the senior management is just indescribably money hungry. That's like the only way to understand them. They're just like, more cash. And you're like, really? Zuckerberg still? The problem is, right, if you make these types of issues and fissures in social epistemology part of your like media strategy, and then you funnel bunches of money into it, you end up with outcomes that are just completely outside the realm of thought, stuff that we thought that we could do with before. And there's a very clear kind of strategy to a bunch of this, right? In the sense that, you know, and I think Twitter's an excellent example of this. Like Elon Musk will be simultaneously, with one hand, like gutting major government programs and then like retweeting like pornographic robot stuff or whatever. And it just has like, and so you're like, it is, I think, oftentimes good for us to think like a part of your job as an economist is to step away from the attention streams of a bunch of these things and be like, wait, how much of my actual attention and timing on my own following of processes is being manipulated here? And so one way of thinking about this, right, is that the cover of these major information networks now in collusion with like some axis of selling the presidency is really, really causing deep epistemological problems, right? What used to be this verified website where you could go and find journalists who would tell you what's up is now full of people who can simply buy verification, right? I think we cover in like very intro micro that you should be able to do things like this, right? And so if you can buy verification, the value of the verification becomes zero. And the current situation on Twitter is that like oftentimes like, what's even going on this thing, right? Well, the problem with this, right, is as this sort of general weird media style attention sucking, like, oh my God, like let's make a scandal after a scandal thing has been done, like that's its own bad political problem. But a lot of stuff has been done in the background then to basically cause large amounts of damage for weird, incoherent, ideological reasons, right? For example, did you guys see this week? All 300 million American social security numbers were apparently taken by the Doge kids and housed off on private servers. So we might need to reissue social security numbers for all Americans. Or, you know, when we think about a bunch of what Musk was doing, but Musk apparently, I choose the America's enemies getting revenge on America thing quite. So Musk had a chip on his shoulder against USAID. He thought USAID was instrumental in the collapse of apartheid South Africa. That's part of why he went after it, right? And in doing this, like we already have estimates that he's probably killed on the order of 300,000 people this year, right? I would say there's a very, very strong case for this guy being considered formally something like a war criminal, in the sense that if you have humanitarian aid contracts and you just unilaterally in some drug-fueled binge decide to just cut them off and just literally turn off the electronic payment systems, like you're leaving people in the lurch under contractual obligation to not do that. We've done this for large amounts of people. The other way of thinking about this is an IDEC alum, Patrick Krause, did the big randomized control trial for universal basic income in the States. A whole bunch of stuff in the States shows that like UBI in the States doesn't do too much to change people's lives. It seems to be a good thing, but it's not like this crazy thing. If you go to other countries, that changes quite a bit. So Ted Miguel, Muncie Colra, MS IDEC class from 2 years ago, is working with Ted on some of this stuff Technical just did a big evaluation with UBI and Centennial, basically showing that you get about halving of infant mortality just for an additional $1,000 around time of birth. So when we think about a bunch of like what the impact of doing something like cutting off humanitarian supply is, like this is not it. This is the order of magnitude we're talking about, right? Like killing large numbers of babies. So this general assault on institutions is difficult for us to understand. Again, that's why I say think about this as like it's a weird criminal organization where like anyone who wants to pay to do harm to the US or just like goad something into happening is apparently getting away with it, or at least has been for a couple of months. Right. So we have estimates as of this week that we've lost 10% of the federal workforce since the beginning of the year. That's like literal decimation. Right. And you make these kinds of cuts, and what happens? Well, on the one hand, right, it is good to keep in mind that this is now opening us up to a lot of potential foreign terror, et cetera, risk. Right. People that are actually over in security have pointed out repeatedly that putting random lackeys in positions of power is one of the worst things that you can do for actual security. Right. And we now have a lot of people on the federal government who are not quite sure how to interact with each other and what to do because they're worried that, maybe the guy they're talking to is going to take the data, put it on a private server, and you just lost 300 million American social security numbers. And so these purges are obviously political in all kinds of nasty ways and doing enormous harm to institutions that are actually kind of important for maintaining stability. Like the Department of Education does a lot of stuff. Department of Labor does a lot of stuff. USAID is intimately involved in all kinds of key processes. The NIH creates needed medicines. And so the cost of this is rapidly accelerating, right? He's already attacked a whole bunch of the universities all kinds of different ways. Does anybody know who Terence Tao is? Probably like top mathematician in the United States, possibly the planet, like superstar, right? They're basically just going after everything they possibly can. One of the ways of thinking about why this is long-term extremely damaging on top of being hideously, morally repugnant is that education is one of our principal export industries. We have incredible comparative advantage in education in the United States, right? We are able to bring students in from all over the world. We tool them up. We push forward the frontier of knowledge. It's a huge part of what like gives us general prosperity. And so attacking it is like attacking one of our key industries. But like you might think about that, like ag too. We're kind of big on ag. And for that matter, the Republicans are classically like rah ag. Does anybody know about the screwworm stuff? This is an excellent example of, it's very economist. We really love boring stuff that's really important, right? The screwworm is a flesh-eating parasite. It's horrifying. It lands on the animals and just like eats up their flesh. Literally, apparently, like a bad screwworm infestation can like kill a cow in 2 weeks, right? They attack livestock, especially cattle, and the U.S. federal government has for decades been dropping irradiated live screwworm larvae all over the Darien Gap in Panama, and has been doing this continuously because what it does is it creates a barrier of infertile versions of the screwworms so that they can't come up from South America. So the United States government has been keeping all of Central America and Mexico and the US and Canada screwworm free. And it is now like they just cut the funding. This is one of these things that must cut. They're just like, nope, federal government doesn't know how to do anything. And so, for example, like this probably means beef prices are going to rise. B, like just get ready for some crazy, horrifying stuff in the news. Like, I don't know, like Bakersfield is a cow town. I would not want to be around like large infestations of this. And so things go down the list, right? The mRNA vaccines that we developed with Moderna and similar are absolute magic. Over in the biological sciences, it is like golden age 2 ever since CRISPR, and with a lot of the various omics techniques, it's magic times. It's incredible. I would say, like in the spirit of where do you go from here in your life, like life sciences is going to be changing in really incredible ways for a while now. So I would recommend looking into it. But that's assuming that we don't have like some crazy former drug dealing, like actual like maniac. Man, if you've read stuff about RFK Jr. and like what he was like in college, he sounds like a serial killer. And he's got the norms of one. And so we just get damage after damage in all these different ways, right? The incredibly offensive and wildly anti-American like immigration enforcement stuff. is morally horrifying. It's also extremely, extremely damaging to the economy over time, right? Classic thing that we know from modern economies is that they are not Malthusian economies. They're not zero sum, they're positive sum. So generically, adding in more people who, especially people who are like motivated to come like invest in the American dream, that raises general prosperity. It's fantastic. But this is what I mean when I see that it's incoherent policy basically being pushed by some kind of like media icon criminal something. Like apparently, again, you can learn so much about this whole crime regime by reading the New York Post in the 1980s. Apparently, sometime in 1986, 87, Trump tried to buy a really fancy piano from Japan and got hit with a tariff and very publicly had a meltdown about how much he hates tariffs. And he has a tariff fixation. If you talk with any normal economist about how you are supposed to structure a modern economy, or for that matter, how to raise public finance, like you do not do it by taxing trade. Are you a maniac? Like you tax stuff you don't like. And so this is A, incoherent policy, B, very, very bad to a whole bunch of the web of trade, and in particular does a lot of damage to essential trust in the US over time. If the US stops acting like a trusting trading partner, people respond in weird ways. For example, Trump has gone back and forth about the de minimis exemption, which is basically like stuff below a certain amount of value, we're not going to tariff, like don't get it twisted. And now he's gone back on it again. And so a whole bunch of countries, like this is relatively recent, the past couple of weeks, are now just like, okay, we're just not going to send packages to the United States because we are certainly not pre-screening them, getting the values and doing all this crazy Mickey Mouse stuff that they're asking us. So as this go forward, the impacts are bad, right? One of the ways of thinking about this is that, to be frank, the equity markets don't seem to know what to do. We're in very uncharted territory. And it's good to keep in mind that like we invented modern macro after the equity markets got a little bit too frisky there in the 1920s and we had a horrible depression, right? They can stay nuts for a while, right? Equity markets are weird. They're doing their thing. So what we can do, for example, is look to currency markets. I'd be like, oh yes, if equity markets are volatile but kind of positive, well, that's not good if it's denominated in dollars and the dollar is lost on average about 10% of its value against a weighted basket of currencies since he became president. That is, I think, one of the clearest ways of thinking about like real damage to the economy and the US's standing in the world. We have endless forms of inflation that we now see peaking in various ways. And this is now feeding back into serious growth effects as well. And so a bunch of what's happened is that we had a really nice economy under Biden, right? In particular, the American economy was able to get through COVID with a really relatively minimal inflation spike and was the only one that came out like gangbusters growing. Right? A whole bunch of other countries really hit like a pretty rough patch post-COVID. And we were just like doing a great job, except now we're basically like taking this and just crashing it into the side of a wall. Right? So like the Inflation Reduction Act was one of the biggest things we could have done against climate change that was possible. It's like this amazing investment in green energy. And we're just like, no, let's just take it all back. Right? We're getting harm to manufacturing. Right? This is all the stuff that we would expect, right? Because at the end of the day, this guy is acting like something like a populist, and like we can go be historical economists and run the little event study. And generically, populists don't work out well for macroeconomies. They're not good at it. But they're usually not this wildly bad, right? And so by measure after measure, uncertainty is incredibly high, right? We actually have a record number of Americans who think that the president is doing a bad job. And so when we think about this, one of the things, like I said before, the equity markets are weird, but like we know that equity markets are weird. This is one of the things I would say, especially also being an economist, go talk with finance people, they're like, oh yeah, they're nuts. The markets with pricing sometimes, whew. And like even people that are active, so this is a really great little discussion between Paul Krugman and Jim Chanos of one of the short selling firms, right? So there's a bunch of these firms out there that will basically find a company, be like, this company is messed up. Let's do some background research. We'll take a position, then release our info and be like, these guys are frauds, right? This Hercules would be a classic example of these. I think they're really cool. I actually like if I were to like change fields, that just sounds like so much fun, right? But so here's a story from one of these guys, right? They found this fraud 2016, 2017. FT ran some stuff in 2019, right? It's like full public knowledge that something was here. KPMG was involved. the stock still traded for another 2 months at a crazy valuation until June 2020, when finally someone admitted, okay, there wasn't the money, and the thing just collapsed. To a certain extent, this is where I think the equity markets are now as we start getting various info in. And this is not the time we want this to be happening, right? For example, right, I would have wanted to talk a bit more about AI stuff in the general econ trajectory. Generically, what I'd say is that the automation wave is starting to hit in certain domains, right? And certain very, very key types of work now are quickly being automated. What I would say is you as students should keep your eyes on what tasks are automatable. And in particular, like the kind of position to be in is like, you want to be the kind of person that can yell at the robots and tell the robots to do stuff, and stay on that side in general as you move forward. That's like my personal advice to you. This is like, we'll have more AI facing sort of stuff later on in the semester. But generically, like, what would be nice is if the president was currently like, oh my gosh, we really have to think about what's going to happen with a bunch of these automation concerns, right? I don't know if you guys have seen this, but like Pope Leo, it's like one of his big things is, what do we do about AI? And what's going to happen if this is like Industrial Revolution 2 and it leads to like crazy types of socialist uprising because people are hungry and can't get jobs? It's like a rational regime would be looking at this and saying, oh man, we got to do something, right? But then a rational regime would also be paying attention to the general fact that nearly all of the recession indicators are now like going through the roof, right? We now like real GDP slowing, consumption's going down. I think price of vegetables is up 40% in a weighted basket in like 2 months because a whole bunch of the labor crackdowns are in ag labor, for example. And the response to this has been a very weird, characteristically mobbed up sort of response, which is do things like go after the head of Bureau of Labor Statistics. So what actually happened with BLS is crazy. BLS was projecting things forward, and they have their normal, like all the random prices and whatnot they're looking at, calculating stuff, and they'll issue corrections. They issued a correction in June that was like, oh yeah, like we thought things were going to be kind of okay in April, but it was actually way worse. Like we had to go back and do a major correction. Like actually labor markets are looking worse, growth is looking worse, et cetera. And the response from Trump and from the Trumpists was basically like, oh my God, BLS is so incompetent that they didn't even know how to do their jobs right, which is madness. It's rather more like we're in this crazy situation trying to predict the future and it's collapsing. So, I mean, my favorite comment on BLS and BLS criticisms is this one. Fun game to play with BLS members is to go, that's stupid. Why do they do it that way? And then go find the paper explaining why they do that and see if you still think it's stupid. I am 0 for 19 in this game. Right? This is like the screwworm stuff. There's tons and tons of boring, regular technical people doing very, very important jobs. A bunch of USF students actually have gone on to work at BLS in the past couple of years, and a bunch of them are still there. So if you start messing with the statistics, then you're really, really in trouble because you can't see what's going on, right? If I can just be like, no, 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 that's not true. Prices are low, hush, hush, hush. I could probably get away with that for a while in a real media environment. Similarly, right? Trump is now actively trying to go after the Fed, right? So he said that he was firing Lisa Cook, right? Pretty famous, high up in the AEA's economist. The Fed responded basically, like, that's illegal, you can't do it. She responded, she's countersuing basically, and saying like, no, you can't do this. I'm doing my job. And he's going after Jerome Powell, right? He's like, oh yeah, this guy. So the Fed is independent by design. Right, this is in a bunch of ways kind of like it's intimately related to the sovereign commitment problem that like gives us the glorious revolution in the 1600s. Like, how do we separate parliament and the power of the purse away from the king? Well, it turns out just generically, the king should not have access to like the infinite money spigot and like be able to do things like lower rates at a time when growth is faltering. Because if you lower rates at a time when growth is faltering, what happens? Stagflation. Right? Nice example of what we think about this, right? Increasing, this is so economist, I love this. In this paper, the guy goes in to try to figure out whether or not pressure applied by the US president seemed to change Federal Reserve behavior and thus cause inflationary policy. Basically, thinking through something similar to what happened here in the 70s with Nixon. The 70s, a famously fantastic time in terms of monetary policy, right? Increasing political pressure by half as much as Nixon for 6 months would raise the price level of about 8%. And so what we're talking about here, orders of magnitude more pressure than Nixon was putting on the Fed chair in the late 60s, early 70s. So what does this mean? Well, I mean, we know from other country examples that this can go really, really bad. So we could enter in some kind of a situation where we've got, you know, like inflation that the US hasn't seen in a while, like 10% or 20%, and no growth. So how do we deal with this? One of the major problems with this is that they're actively going against the legal enforcement. And so, for example, right, like Lisa Cook countersues, Harvard countersues, et cetera. Sometimes they win, sometimes they don't. Generically, like even a bunch of his appointed judges, Republican appointed judges, are still ruling against him over and over. But he's also just very blatantly, obviously collapsing into like the desire to be a dictator. He's on camera a couple days ago being like, people say they want a dictator, maybe they should have a dictator. He's like, I'm the president, that means I can do whatever I want. And we're now seeing a bunch of people in his weird sycophancy network, right, who are popping up saying stuff like this. Right? They already made like third term hats. So what this means is that we now have this really like major weird economic problem that's resolving that's like a legal problem. It's like, can the president do this? Will we allow this guy to just be openly criminal in public? How long does this persist and where does it go? So one thing I would say this is that there is a lot of general hope, and I'd say like people respond quite quickly, right? I think there's a lot of both like stuff that's going on that you can connect into in terms of how I kind of thought of this. This is perhaps the hardest part of this for me to do, just to be like, what can I give you guys as actual advice? One thing that I would say is like take seriously the mandate that you like by virtue of being here in grad school or undergrad, like you're students, you're nerdy and motivated enough to come to my talk. The way that I think about this is that like you should be aggressively informing yourself. And something that I would say is really kind of key to this is like when Twitter broke down, I switched over to Blue Sky, which is nice. It's very nerdy. It's definitely like lib Twitter. As someone said, they still think that you can cancel people over there. It's at the same time like one of the only places that I actually get good technical news anymore. And what I used to get from Twitter, which is like having this big extended department across all these other places, doing all the weird work that I do, and like, oh, this specific niche specialist does this, et cetera, is more or less replicated on Blue Sky now, in particular for journalists. Right. I think that is one of the cleanest, easiest ways of cutting through the bizarro misinformation is if you're like, oh, this is the Washington correspondent for Al Jazeera. Oh, this is like these are nameable, specific, identifiable people. So then you actually know that the news you're getting is good. And I do think like your role as a student in this is serious in the sense that other people know that you are studying in school and learning stuff. And so if you are able to sway people's opinions often, right? Especially if you're coming from econ and you can just be like, oh yeah, no, the problem with it is this. Oh yeah, but the dollar is down 10%, Dad, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Second major thing that I would really advise you to do is communicate to those who are within political and general positions of power, right? Like it sounds corny, but like if everybody in this room called every one of their reps once a week on specific topics they cared about, they'd actually make material change. Like small numbers of crank type calls to politicians get a lot done. And I do along these lines, like I think one of the best ways to think about this is find your specific issues that you want to be a crank about, where it's like, I cannot believe they did this, and call. Right? And be like, yeah, like, hey, so they did another one of these ICE raids. Like, this is absolutely unconstitutional and un-American. Like, you need to get them out now, or I'm going to run for office and unseat you myself. Which is always a nice threat, by the way. Along these lines, right, I think at this space, writing publicly, being engaged with stuff, in one form or another, organizing, to be quite frank, I mean, if you can help organize class action lawsuits, if you're the kind of person who's like, oh, maybe I would think it, like, there's a lot to be done with a whole bunch of these things because they're moving so quickly through so many institutions, right? That just, again, like choosing to be like, oh, like, how would I possibly help out? Like, what's a good example? Like the Forest Service, national parks, choose one, right? Another major point that I'd say is that connecting with others who are like-minded is very important, both within the United States, but also I'd say in particular this moment abroad. Because this is a weird thing where most of the rest of the planet is similarly not happy with what's going on with the US presidency. And I think clarity on that and being able to coordinate with others, for example, I mean, the fact that we're going to like lose all these small scale packages from all these countries like now, right? That we're going to have a whole bunch of other like higher price stuff hitting in this fall. These are the sorts of things that they put pressure on people to act. And so I think, there we go. Sorry. Along those lines, like I do think that there's like moral strength in numbers for stuff like this. And I think like banding together with other people, right, to act together, well, just makes it nicer. And then the last thing that I kind of say with this is over in climate stuff, there's this really hot stuff these days called strategic foresight, which is like, we should be thinking about funding for the serious climate future that's coming towards us, as opposed to like little stuff right now. We should be like, okay, like if the AMOC might actually shut down, like what do we need to do working back from a couple of decades from now to not have that happen? And I'd say at this point, that's actually one of the things you guys should start doing generically as you get more informed about these processes. Like, is next year the best year to start a new firm? I don't know, and it depends, but like these guys are grabbing chunks of any firm that does well. And so it really kind of depends on where you are and how you think about it, right? Is next year a good year to go to grad school? Maybe. Is next year a good year to maybe go work outside the US for a bit? Maybe. Various things depending on who you specifically are and how you're thinking about things. And in terms of like how I think about this, it's a very, very chaotic time, but in the fact that it's chaotic, there's actually a lot of hope in this sense that that's actually when you're powered in a bunch of ways as an intellectual is magnified. If you can maintain coherence, if you have clear eyes on stuff and you're like, oh, this is what's going on, this is why we shouldn't be able to do this, right? I'm going to call my representative and be like, he's trying to fire the Fed governor. Are you crazy? This is like, I'm an ex-finance person. Like, you can't do this, right? Having clarity of mind and being able to like tell other people what's going on is quite powerful and does shift systems. So I'm gonna leave that up there. We're at time. I don't think anyone's gonna kick us out, so I was gonna open up for questions.